Okay, dear colleagues, let's start the best book panel ever on this Danyliw seminar.
Nice beginning. Yeah?
This is a book panel devoted to Ioulia Shukan's book, Génération Maïdan. I'll start by a disclaimer. I may be not the best discussant for this book panel. If the discussant is supposed to be neutral, objective, with a distance to the book, I have absolutely no distance to this research and to her book. But actually, yeah. You've seen both of us a lot during this Danyliw seminar, and we're sorry about that. But this time, it's for it's for a good cause. Really, let me just say a few words before giving the floor to Ioulia for a more or less short presentation of her work. First of all, the title. The book, as you understand, is in French. So please, for those who are not French speakers, learn French as as quickly as possible. Because as you all
the best
have
production is in French.
As you all have already understood, this Danyliw seminar has a very strong French touch, and I think sources in French, and not only this book, but also the previous works that were presented here, are in French, and Ukrainian studies are growing, incredibly growing in the French-speaking world right now. So this is, yeah, you cannot expect. You cannot do without French now in the Ukrainian studies.
Without France, since we are
without France and without French. So, unfortunately, I'll have to translate some things about this book to this audience, but still. The title is Génération Maïdan, Maïdan Generation. Why Maïdan Generation? This is, I think, we had a lot of discussion about this title, but I think this is a perfect title for what is your project in this book, which is to show what kind of group of Ukrainians emerge from Maïdan, starting from Maïdan revolution, to become what can genuinely called a new generation of Ukrainians. This is not Ukrainians born on Maïdan. I don't think there have been, unfortunately, a lot of deaths on Maïdan, but no births, but a new generation of Ukrainians was genuinely born there, created by these events. This book has a starting point, and Maïdan Revolution is the starting point, but I think that it's a good and a bad thing. This book doesn't have an end point. The generation born with Maïdan is in charge now, it's developing now. Those people are growing, are changing the country, are changing themselves. So Ioulia had to stop at some point her presentation and the writing process. But I think a generation Maïdan 2, 3, 4, and 5 are would be great in the next years to see how the country and the citizens of the country have been transformed by these events of winter 2013-2014. Just a few words about the structure of the book for those who will not be lucky enough to read it by themselves. This is the book is structured in 9 chapters, organized in a semi-chronological order, which means that we follow this recent history of Ukraine, the birth of the revolution, the development of the revolution, the violence appearing in these on Maïdan, but also in the lives of the citizens who took part in Maïdan revolution, the beginning of the war, the development of the war, the transformation of the society by this armed conflict, and we actually we are still at this point. I think they could be more chapters, but this is how it's organized. The book follows a very interesting structure. It tells us the events by the means of the stories of ordinary citizens involved in the events and in the transformation of the Ukrainian society. Revolutionaries, ordinary people on Maïdan, less ordinary people on Maïdan, volunteers involved in different projects, etc., etc. We are following the stories of these people through the book, and through them we understand what happened in Ukraine, and most of all, what Ioulia will talk a little bit more about that. How the events changed the course of their life, and how this changed the Ukrainian society itself. I remember that the publisher told the author of this book that this would be a book for people who already know everything about Maïdan, and just would just want to get a reminder of what they already know. I think this is true and false at the same time. I think people who know the events very well will find that this book will experiment the emotions they had during different phases of the revolution, the armed conflict, the transformation of the society, and will gain some distance and some distant understanding of what most of them experience. And people who don't know, and I think this is a book particularly interesting for people who don't know anything about Ukraine and anything about this, the transformation of the Ukrainian society. So it is really to be advised to those among your friends and relatives who just would like to understand what's going on but are not ready to read academic developments we are used to, because this is a book in which the author uses personal stories and emotion to access not only the facts, not only to tell the facts and the factual story, but a deeper understanding of what people like you and me and your neighbors expressed during these events in the Ukrainian society. I'll stop there and let Ioulia present her book.
Thank you, Anna, for this wonderful presentation of my book. So I will continue and trying to explain to you. I position this book as a non-academic book, but being a sociologist, of course, I have a particular focus. And I have a particular narrative procedures of telling these stories of my characters. Can I have my slides, please? So Anna mentioned already in the presentation that I have a focus on ordinary citizenship. The book has two parts. You see, while reading it, stories of people, ordinary citizens on Maïdan, so throughout the winter 2013-2014. And then you have stories of people, the lived experience through the armed conflict, stories of IDPs, stories of volunteers, stories of ordinary families, and the way the war impacts a family also. And by ordinary, I mean several things. Ordinary is just, in the general sense, opposed to institutional, actually, institutional politics. And ordinary practices go beyond the very traditional citizenship acts, especially when we think about citizenship, we think about voting, participation in electoral campaign, or even rather traditional public gathering, not a revolutionary gathering for 3 months on one place, but just one short collective action. From this point of view, stories and practices I've been tracing are ordinary. They're also ordinary in the sense that they're all about producing or thinking about the common, how to live together, actually, what is to be done for the society in the whole, and practices such as concern for the loved ones, for example, or just for a human being, forms of collective action in relation with Maïdan. And practices that, and I show this through the trajectories that I've been following, that they may result in a long-last engagement, actually. I should click here, yes. What this kind of lenses helps me to show through those stories, as Anna mentioned in the presentation, altered life course. Because I was struck really with the change and the way a critical event makes an eruption in your ordinary life and changes totally your life. And there is a turning point, so the point when your life changes, you have the event, so the lived experience of the event and the way it transforms the individual also. And you have this, as a result, a kind of dramatic changes. I have been witnessing in different sites, even now. And by change, dramatic change, I mean it may be death, of course, because I have a story of death on Maïdan. It might be also just change of your social worlds. Actually, someone who has nothing to do with military or paramilitary worlds becomes militarized and have a close connection with this kind of worlds. I was trying also to grasp ordinary senses and representations, and especially in relation with Maïdan and mobilization on Maïdan, because some of our colleagues, a kind of ex post analysis, they tried to inscribe mobilization in senses in the traditional political science category of democracy. And what I'm showing through these stories, that we're not thinking about democracy when we go out into streets, we're thinking about something different. We may have and I show this, have experienced corruption in different forms. For example, a student, and I have a story of a student, having experienced corruption on a daily basis in the university. And of course, this experience may enter in resonance with the claims of the collective movement. I have another story of construction worker, seasonal construction worker, who has been working in Kyiv region and working on construction sites for elites. So he saw this difference between richness and poorness, and he's from Lugansk. He's from Lutsk. And also there is a resonance between what is said about the movement and his perception of the movement and his lived experience. And all this is structured mainly about justice and injustice and not about democracy or autocracy. Europe also, it was very difficult in France with this rather negative image of Europe and Brussels bureaucracy to explain how Europe can be an attractive point, for example, for those protesters. And now through the story of this construction worker, Yevgen, I show that, of course, it's an idealized image of Europe. He has some ideas about what Europe is, and when you listen to him, you understand that it's an utopia, of course. But still, it's just a reference point for him, and it's this reference point that moves him and makes him act, because he became this permanent members of Maïdan. He has lived on the place for the 3 months of mobilization and even later on. Forms of acting together also, because I have different forms I describe in through the stories. On Maïdan, what I call revolutionary routines. Actually, we don't think about, when we think about collective action, about all the small things that people do that are not strategic, of course, but they are so important for the movement, actually. And its results, so cooking, providing first aid, standing guard, patrolling, all this I explain through those stories, because I have different profiles of people, and they find they in some different places also on Maïdan, and they acting through different collectives. Social care provision, and I have two stories from Kharkiv. Story of Stanция Kharkiv, Station Kharkiv, a group of volunteers caring about IDPs, and I have a sequence. They have been holding a kind of hosting point at Yuzhny Vokzal in Kharkiv. So when IDPs, people were moving, trying to escape from war, they were hosting them, trying to find a provisional solution for housing, just taking care about them while they were waiting on the railway station, providing psychological support also, without being psychologues, actually. And the second point of observation I have presented last year, military hospital in Kharkiv. I've been working with volunteers in this hospital, and so I have stories also of those mainly women caring about wounded. And building and reforming the army, I was trying to also present how those volunteers trying not to act behind the state, but also influence the state. And I have the story of this volonтерский descent. I call, in French, I translated it like infiltration, but volunteers becoming the state, trying to become the state, acting through the state and state agencies, and reconstruct the army. Yeah. Also, I'm trying to trace vehicles of attraction and attachment to place and people. To these why questions that we have in sociology, why people stay, why maybe it would be easier just to give up and to go home. And I wanted to stop on two sequences, emotions. Anna also mentioned emotions in her presentation. I show that emotions is a very powerful mechanism of getting in, joining the movement, but also staying in the movement, which is also different from this idea of democracy as a driving force. You see the picture of Olesia Zhukovskaya. On the top story, you know all very well, the girl who was wounded on the February 20th on Maïdan. She was thinking that she's dying, and she was in the medical service, and she tweeted that I'm dying, and she became actually known like this. Alice is one of my characters that I've met after, because I usually met them during the event, and I've been following them through event. But why I tell Alicia's stories? I don't tell the story of the wound and the way what happened. Actually, I tell the story of her attraction. How this girl, a very young girl, became attracted and came to Maïdan and stayed to Maïdan. And what I showed in the beginning, it was just curiosity. She was attracted. She has been going very often to festivals, and Maïdan looked like a festival for her, actually, because of this feast atmosphere and etc. And what is also interesting in her story is microgroups, because we know those big groups, self-defense after Maïdan, but you have only very micro groups, like a small tent, for example, on Maïdan. And Olesia has also a small group, Pekelna Bochka, the Hell's Barrel. A small group of young people who were just staying around this barrel where a fire was set, and this group actually they moved through the movement through the Maïdan, through the collective movement all together, and that's also a powerful mechanism of staying, because you are with those you love, you appreciate, etc. And those groups act as also. They help to find a place, actually. I have a story, for example, of after Maïdan and the way through social networks people can find a place, how it might be helpful. Of course, we know all these ideas, but I wanted to describe them and to tell those stories in their materiality and their mechanisms also. And emotions, of course, are very important and powerful for the involvement in face of the war. And you have the second image, it's Nadezhda Kamar, and she's from the volunteer group Sister of Mercy, Kharkiv Sister of Mercy. She's working at the military hospital for 2.5 years. And Nadia's story, she had a friend who was mobilized, actually, a loved one who was mobilized, and she was trying to feel the same things as him. And of course, she was not thinking about going to the army and being mobilized also, being enrolled. But she decided to go to the hospital, and it took her 3 months to get there, because other girls, they didn't have place to host so many volunteers at that moment. But she insisted, and she went there. The guy, actually, her friend, is back, and she's still in the hospital and continuing to and acts in the hospital. Also, I will speed up, socialization mechanisms. And I show it, first of all, on Maïdan through what I call revolutionary vacations, revolutionary socialization. When you come on a protest place, you're not revolutionary. You are not there maybe to stand for till the end of the movement. But the settings, and I explain how the place itself, with its scene, with the discussions, both and senses that circulate both in vertical and horizontal way, they reinforce this desire to stay. I also show the learning process, for example, how you learn how to use milk and lemon when they're tear gas, for example. And other things, and maybe also I will stop on radicalization process, because I trace it both on Maïdan, and I'm trying to trace it on volunteers through their stories. On Maïdan, radicalization, it's an attempt to explain why you resort to violence. And it's not because you are in ultranational group, I mean, it's not because you are private sector, but how being a ordinary citizen in this situation of frustration, accumulated frustration because of refusal by the Yanukovych regime to make concessions, but because also there is a state repression and the image of an illegal repression, an illegitimate repression, because repression delegated to those people that were called titushki, Jan Sachs, used by the power. So I describe this spiral of violence actually, because this repression by the state, of course, incites to go further and further in repression also, and to use violence. And I describe also this very material part, how you buy bulletproof jackets, how you think about buying an arm also, because of this violence you're confronted to. And the last picture, this one picture, is a picture of sense of belonging. So I also reflect on the way how both participation in Maidan and then different volunteering initiatives, they forge this sense of belonging. Victoria Sirida, she provided us with quantitative also data on this sense of belonging and the way it might be reinforced, and I'm following this more ethnographic way and show, for example, how in the hospital, we're here in the hospital, in the volunteers room, and they always have this kind of strichki, I don't know how do you call it, bracelety, as they distribute them. So people bring them to the volunteers room, and they distribute them to soldiers who are taken care in the hospital. And I also continue to trace this long-lasting engagement actually, because I've told you Nadia, for example, she's been going to the hospital for two years and a half, and so my idea is to go back once again every time to see the impact of volunteering also on their social life, different facets of the social life. And maybe a very last point, and I'll stop here, something that is present in the book, but actually which relates to my more academic projects, and I think it echoes to research you are conducting. We were several to conduct this reflection about the state and the definition what state is actually, and what society is, and what are the state functions, and what is the perimeter of state intervention, and what is can be cared or taken in charge by the society. So. I encompass the state actually, and in the case of military hospital, the state is a military hospital because it's a state institution, and the way volunteers compensate, and by doing this they also redefine this perimeter actually, of state action and state functions. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I forgot to show you the last one.
Thank you, Ioulia. I see a paradox. This was a very academic presentation, right? And we understand very well what your focus is, ordinary citizens, what are the different ways to approach this topic, and the interest for political sociology to approach the transformation of the Ukrainian society, but also collective movement, involvement, relationship of citizens with the state by these ordinary citizens. But at the same time, this book is not this. I mean, this is not a short, this is not the book in short. The book is very different. Yeah. The book is for general audience. The book is full of long personal stories. No, stories of people, not personal stories, but stories of people. The book is full of people's emotions. And I remember very well that after your repeated stays in Ukraine, she spent more time in Ukraine than in France, definitely, during these last years, you told me, I'm going to write a book. I was like, great. We need a book in France. But it will be a book for general audience. I'm not sure what I'm doing now is good for an academic book. I'm not sure that what I'm working on is an academic project. Why?
Good question. Excellent question. I think several reasons. The one, I have a kind of disclaimer in the introduction to the book. There is this phrase, those are human and subjective stories. Because, of course, those are subjective stories. Those testimonies, I mean, it's not in the way of testimony. It's a story I'm telling through I have been seen and observed and after discussion with those people. Of course, subjective in the sense that they are influenced by the events. They had experienced strong emotions, of course. They have a social position which also defines their point of view. They have lived some dramatic experiences. They've lost their loved ones on Maïdan. They escaped the war, for example, because they have stories of IDPs. They just decided to move out from Crimea because annexation was, and staying in Crimea was out of question for Crimean Tatar family I describe in the book. So those are, of course, subjective. It's their point, and I wanted actually to tell their point because it was very important, even for me as a sociologist, to get this subjectivity and to tell it to the story. There is a question also of my subjectivity. I think that in, how to say it, in academia we all afraid of being subjective, afraid of being accused of our subjectivity, while we are still all subjective actually. And we are trying to hide ourselves behind the theory, of course. Theory is a kind of bulletproof jacket. Sources, the way we use, of course, our sources, and distance. Maybe it's less accurate for anthropology and sociology, but in political science, it's the less you go there, the better it is, actually. The more the distance you have, the more objective you are. I don't want to... I'm sorry, it's not against someone in particular. It's just something I've done also, because I've produced work as a political scientist and not so much based on my ground observations, and I've done something very difficult. So in this case, I've been there, I witnessed, I experienced. Of course, myself, I had emotions, and I have them when I talk about my characters. So I decided to assume this actually subjectivity. And also the kind of, because subjectivity goes also in neutrality, and objectivity in academia goes also with the kind of vocabulary that we use. No emotions, and no place actually for explaining them. I didn't want to be restricted by this. And I wanted to go beyond. And that brings me to the second reason. These academic frames, I found them really restrictive. My idea was to tell an event, a particular event or a consequence, for example, an event through a personal story. So it's a long, it's a 10-page story sometimes. So you cannot cut it and make it and fit actually in these academic restrictive frames. Actually, I managed to do this, to use some of these stories and to reduce them to small citation. I was with a colleague who helped me actually to do this, because it was so painful, because the book was already written at that moment. So yeah, I found them very restrictive, and I wanted to go beyond. I decided to go beyond, and maybe there is also my vision of the public. And here I will refer to Mayhill's very beautiful metaphor of the bookshelf. I explained during our summer schools, we usually ask this question to students, so to help them to make a focus, to define their focus in the study. So Mayhill has a beautiful metaphor of the bookshelf. So where you see what kind of, at what bookshelf you see your book, and that will help you also to work your argument. So I was also seeing my bookshelf, as Anna told. I was not saying it's on a bookshelf sociology. I saw my public as not a public of colleagues, but a public of people sensible to processes in post-Soviet state. And maybe I'm very ambitious. I saw it broader. I don't know. We will see whether it works or not. Actually, And I had this idea that, when you tell a personal story, it's the best way to provoke an identification process. You can identify with the people, and for example, all the stories of people caring, volunteers caring about IDPs. In France, you see also this volunteering movement with migrants and solidarity, actually, different forms of solidarity. So that was my idea, and that's why also I decided to go beyond this. And maybe the last explanation, I'll stop here, temporality. I think that in academia we have a very long temporality. You know it all, the process of peer reviewing and etc. And actually, it's a long time. I've been doing fieldwork research for a long time, and sometimes I have beautiful stories. I mean, beautiful not in terms of the narrative line, but beautiful that they're telling something about political processes. For example, when I was working on a piece, I didn't publish them. I didn't find the way, to make them public. And here I wanted to publish these stories because I thought that it would be interesting for the others also.
Well, I think this is a question more general than you think. When you feel uncomfortable with within these frames of academic writing, you can either adjust to academic writing or choose general audience, or explode the borders of what academic writing is, right? And if we as researchers doing qualitative field work feel this pain in kind of transforming so radically what we see on the ground in our writing, I think we have to think about how academia sees the way we write. And it deserves to be actually an academic book with footnotes, with bibliography, but with the same attention to stories and to long stories, not cut in small quotations, which is, of course, really painful and less interesting for the reader. Right?
Don't forget the editor. He doesn't like footnotes.
We have to work with publishers about that. My next question is building on what you just said. We had a very beautiful explanation of what you also experienced on the ground in the discussion with Elena after the film on how what you're doing when you work transforms you, and places you're in transform your way of feeling, thinking. It's not only about being involved in the phenomenon that you study. We all experience that observation, and then you have a disclaimer in your article and your book, but you never tell that, okay, it changed me dramatically. Did it change you?
Yes, I think yes. At least it has changed my focus, not my methodology, because I've been working, trying to have some ethnographic sequences while doing political sociology. And when I was working on, for example, parliamentary practices, so going with MPs, accompanying them, not listening to their discourses because they're professionals, of course, of communication, just observe them actually and grasp through observation, produce some conclusions. So I had this the same methodology actually for this book and for my more academic projects I've been conducting. I think it has changed my focus. My PhD was on elites, Communist Party leaders, life stories, of course. So you actually changes, but not totally, as we say it in French, definitely in English also. You always, to some extent, you're always the same. But very, very at the very beginning of Maïdan, I was much more interested in ordinary senses, representations, practices, and in elite stories. And actually, in the book, there is a story of an MP, and it's a kind of tribute to my previous work. It's a story of Lesia Rabets, young MP. She has been very involved during the movement, and actually I have worked with Lesia as an MP also, and her practice and her way of working with with constituents, and as I saw her and I observed her and I've been with her in different sequences on Maïdan, so I've written her story also. But yeah, there is a change of focus, I think, and this focus on ordinary citizenship. Maybe it made me more emotional also, and that's why I decided to break, this some constraints and limits. I'm not sure that I would have written the same book like 5 years ago. I don't know. So definitely, I think there is a change.
Yeah, just to add something to this, Ioulia is not visible in the book. We can see that she's there because she's like, and at that moment I see this person, and in the discussion he tells me or she tells me, but we don't feel you in the book, and this is I think the researcher you trying to hide behind your characters, and I think that a book is to be written on the researcher in conflict situation, the researcher in difficult situation, of what we experience, and this is of general interest, but this is for academic interest first. This is the kind of methodology we definitely miss.
Introspection, of course.
No, it's not about
No, I see your point. Of course, it's a deliberate choice. And you're right, I'm present there, and not only through these different phrases I saw or I did or something, through the narrative, the way I told the story actually, because there are few citations actually. It's my way of telling this story, not transforming the story, but just putting in what's this story. There are also, researchers. There are also the context, providing context and contextualizing also those story. I was not ready to put myself in this book.
Last question before we open it up to discussion. You have a very particular methodology of working with your characters. You have selected, as a filmmaker, you have selected your characters and you follow them. And you follow them, you're back to them several times during the book, during what is covered in the book. But the book is published and you're still returning to see your characters in Ukraine. So what's next?
A couple of articles to write with more academic, within more academic limits. I think the project, the most, I call it ethnographic returning, even if I don't know if we may call it ethnography or not. I think the most, I went so far in this returning procedure with military hospital in Kharkiv, because I have been there many times. I have worked with those women. They became friends, of course. I have an emotional engagement also with the group. You cannot stay, outside. And I'm continuing to follow them because I think the story is it's not the end of the story. And you are right, because even in this book, you can add chapters actually and trace the story, because I see also some new processes, new consequences. For example, social, professional marginalization as a consequence of involvement in volunteering. Some problems with health as also a consequence of physical and emotional also épuisement. Extension, exhaustion, but I think it's a good procedure in terms of grasping processes, temporality, and biography also. So trying to put them together. and I have really wonderful stories because sometimes I stop the story of the person. I mean, the book is constructed. I stop the story of the person at the chapter. For example, I have the story of a guy, and I told through him the radicalization process. And now I see him, and he was not so radical as he is right now. And it's the war also, because he became a volunteer, and he was going to. He was not fighting, but he was helping. One of the volunteer battalions, and he's acting closely with those volunteers from this battalion. And so I can trace this process of radicalization. It's not just something, they are violent, because violence is their mean of action. I can trace how the person may accept violence in this critical process, and I think it's something very important to trace, and that's why I'm returning there. And I have another project which is not in the book. I have this project about vigilante groups, but it's also related actually to the consequences of the crisis, Ukrainian crisis, and the armed conflict, and the self-defense groups in Odessa, and the way they are interacting with the state.
All right. Maybe you have questions and remarks. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I hope I'll have a chance to read this book of yours. Just a couple of hopefully quick questions. Firstly, I was wondering how you selected which testimonies you included and which you didn't. What the kind of the thought process was there, and also. I was interested in the way you said that it was a turning point, and I can veritably believe that for some people this really was a turning point in their ordinary lives. But I wanted to tease you on how that sort of revolutionary trajectory has continued. Has it? You certainly spoke about some people that it really has. Has that been a widespread phenomenon that that trajectory has continued, or has there been a change in the wake of that period? Thank you.
Because of my the way I'm doing my methodology, if I use academic term, I'm unable to tell you about the scope of the phenomenon actually, and it's a very good question, and maybe it's insensitive to work with those who have done already more quantitative research on these questions, because I can tell you the story, trace the story from the life trajectory and explain some phenomena and show that there is long-lasting engagement. But I cannot generalize. I can just go comparative and compare, for example, I have also some contacts in Kiev hospital, military hospital, because it's people I've been following since Auto Maïdan, and I have this also kind of long-lasting engagement. But I'm unable to generalize and to say that yes, we have a new nation. We have definitely a generation of like people acting and exercising their citizenship in a new way. But I'm not able to say how wide the phenomena is. For the selection of stories, I had I had also this more sociological sociological research, because concerned that I wanted them to be representative, of course, and I had other stories of that kind. But of course, as I wanted to tell a story, significant story, from the point of view of phenomenon I wanted to highlight, of course, I've picked a story that helped me to tell and to highlight those points. But I defend it's a representative story. It's not just a unique story, a beautiful, unique story.
Okay, Ivan, please.
Thank you. You mentioned a very important story of Ioulia Shukan.
It doesn't work.
Sorry?
It doesn't work. Yeah, it works.
Thank you. You mentioned a very important story of Ioulia Shukan. I did also research about this as part of my Maïdan massacre study, and I think this is a crucial case. I think one of the most important cases which actually would tell more about what happens and kind of conventional narrative. Because according to my research, I cited witnesses immediately from Maïdan protesters. They said on video that she was shot from a direction of from a building which was controlled by which was used as headquarters of right sector on Maidan. And recently she gave a television interview, actually to Russian TV, in which she showed her position and wounds, location, and again pointed into the same direction of right sector headquarters. And official investigation recently stated that she was among about half of all protesters who were wounded from locations which were not in government control areas. So basically acknowledgement that she was wounded from Maidan control area. So I just wonder if you have any information in your, or if you cite any information, or if you know anything about circumstances of her shooting or investigation results, and also who was the male protester who was shot along with her, because there is still no information if his name or whether he was just wounded or killed. Thank you.
No, I don't. In the book, I told the story of Ioulia in the beginning, actually, through December events, because I think that her story is really revealing of attractive power of Maidan for the youngs, for example, and that's why I put only. I wanted to highlight this unknown story, not the known story, actually. But as concerning your question of Maidan massacre. There are some sequences that I tell also in this book, but I have chosen to tell the subjective point of view of those who were there. And I show, for example, how this narrative of sniper, it's not an invention, it's something that helped protesters to explain what they were just experiencing at that moment on the ground. Actually, in the situation when they were shooting, it's emerged, actually, was co-produced by all the others, the medical personnel who were operating people, protesters who were going down from Institutska. And this narrative emerged because it helped to explain also what was going on. And I have a story of it is called the story of two Andrews. It's a story of an uncle who had been in the self-defense, and he was shot on October 20th, and the story of his nephew and also Andrei, and he was in Pravy sector at the same time in Lvivska Sotnya at that moment, and he survived actually, but while he was in the same sequence, and I give his point of view, and he's also defends that it was a question of snipers, it was a question, and those who were shooting, it was Berkut. And he explains, actually, in the story, you can see, he explains where he was, what he saw, and how he has his narrative through what he has lived on the place. And I tell this story through them, actually, and not through Ioulia.
Yes, please.
There's a subtopic that I think deserves further exploration, but I've not had a chance to read Génération Maïdan yet, so perhaps it's already been addressed, and if so, I apologize for raising it. The issue is initial motivation. I would say that maybe there was more than just curiosity involved, especially in view of the fact that it was, I think, September 2013 that Andrei Ilarionov published a blog entry in which he made a survey of sociological surveys from the time of independence up to the then present. And he saw that there was a trend towards pro-Western views in Ukraine, especially among the youth. And by then he claimed that even in the far east of the country, the majority of the youth was more interested in good relations with the West than with Russia. And so that's the question I'd like to address. What really brought people out onto the streets? I mean, it had to be more than just mere curiosity at that point already. Thank you.
The focus is not only on curiosity, of course. Curiosity is one of the mechanisms. For example, in the story of Ioulia, I tell also her story of being a medic. And she was, in Ukraine you have this obligatory system of attribution when you are sent in the rural regions, actually rather remote rural areas, and she was sent, and she explains this because she had not money to pay bribe, actually. So you have different lived experience, and that's what I explain in the book, that enter into resonance with the ideals and ideas and senses that circulated on Maidan. Of course, for her corruption, it was embodied in something. it was a sense of injustice because of the situation she has experienced. And that was my way, actually, to work on corruption, not saying that corruption is a powerful vehicle for action. It's just the experience and the way people are confronted to corruption that may bring them to act. The same with Europe, injustice. I'm sorry I have not heard about democracy. Actually, from this point of ordinary citizens, I have never heard the term of democracy. I have heard it from my colleagues, journalists, and etc.
Natalia, please.
Thank you, Ioulia, for this great presentation. I really look forward to reading your book. And the question I have is two questions. The first one is about the recent turn to volunteer movement. You've told us stories about new solidarities, new forms of attachment. Last year, during your presentation, you talked about this total engagement that volunteers have in relation to their volunteer work. Does it remain like that? Do you see any traces of disengagement when people drop out of volunteer movement? And what are the reasons? Have you encountered stories like that? And the second question regarding your methodology. As Anna pointed out, you're not really visible in the book. You don't put yourself out there, but you're visible in other ways, the way you structure the stories, the way you select the stories. What about the experience of collecting information? Did you try to make yourself invisible throughout these practices of volunteering and just observe? Did you try to ask questions and ask your observants to elaborate on their practices as they understand them? What was the most challenging in actually collecting information on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, for your question. I will to provide you my answers. I will talk about this group in Kharkiv I've been following, and so in Kharkiv Military Hospital. Actually, the number of people involved in this volunteering group has reduced from 2014 and now. I explained this. Those who quit actually opted out. It was a question of money. There was also a tension about money because volunteers have to maintain this trust relationship with those with people they are collecting money from actually, and those who have quitted the group, they took money actually. So it's a kind of process of selection within the group, and it's the group working also on it. It's a test, kind of test. And those who have not resisted to the temptation, they have quitted the group. And now the core, they are 5 or 6 actually, and they were about 20. And also there was a young man also helping them. He got involved. He got enrolled. He also, this experience and communication with the military pushed him to enroll at his turn also. And as for the way, my ways of doing, of course, the idea is to become, Maïdan, it was easy to become invisible. But in the hospital, of course, I'm trying to be one of them. And it's easy when I stay, for example, for 2 weeks, and I'm acting on the regular basis. It's less easy when I come just for 3 days, for example. And when I stay it's a long stay, I do the same things that they are doing. So I go to the rooms also. I bring things to military, and after we discuss all the time. We may discuss just politics. We may discuss our personal life, but the ways they are doing also. I ask questions. And maybe
they know you are a researcher, right?
No, I think I had a problem with they perceive me as a writer, actually, not a researcher, as a writer, and it was, but
which is true.
Maybe maybe you had also this problem explaining to your to persons you meet that you are a researcher. They perceive you. It's easier for them to categorize you as a journalist, for example. You write something, so you're a journalist, and I'm a writer. Yeah. So I don't register. I never register. Because I think it will also break this relationship between me and them. It will be barriers, additional barrier. I'm one of them, so I'm doing things. In the evening when I go to the hotel and stay hotel Kharkiv, so I write down things. So I have also my small block note, and I put some words, like a kind of keyword that will help me to reconstitute the situation or the dialogue. Of course, there are losses, but actually, it's the price to pay to get this relationship, to have this kind of relationship.
As for your first question, I found it striking. I just add something. I found it striking how many when rereading the book, how many characters in the book have health issues, are ill at the end of the events, are tired, and I think we're at a turning point when something changed, the energy is going down. Okay, at the end of the session, we have a lot of questions and 5 minutes left, so I don't know what my strategy is. I take Victoria's question because she was there really early. You answer it, and then I collect all the rest of the question, and you have the final word.
Ioulia, you titled Generation of Maïdan, and if you think of Maïdan, there were also 2 other protests or revolutions. And from our in-depth interviews with Euromaidan participants, this Orange Revolution is very much in their experiences if we are talking about middle age or a little bit older. And even for those who are young people, like in their 20s, it was 10 years ago, but they remember their families were involved or they helped with certain things. Do you trace this? Then we really can speak about generation of Maïdan, because this is not only recent event, but 10 years ago was also important for them to behave now differently.
I use a generation in the term of new generations that has been emerging, not in the same terms of continuity, but you are right. In the book, I also trace this continuity for those who had this continuity link with the Orange Revolution. But what is striking for those who have participated, of course, they have accumulated kind of experience, protest experience. They know what to do and how to act. But it's a relation to politics, institutional politics, which is really interesting because a kind of deception right after Orange Revolution and a new distance. If the distance during those revolutionary moments, the distance between the citizen and institutional politics reduces because it's through the streets that politics enters also in this institutional arena. And all those who have told me that they have participated, they were very, very distant from all those political and even activism processes. And they're different from this point of view after Maidan, but the events are different also, the follow-up events that Ukraine has been experiencing, so maybe definitely there is something.
Okay, we had 2 questions in the back there, and then I'll take Mayhill, Daniel, and Hannah, and we'll stop there. And you have a piece of paper there.
Anna, I can skip because Victoria asked
all right, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes, as I listened to your presentation about your book, I'm struck by what sounds like a parallel between your book and Voices from Chernobyl by
Alexievich.
Nobel Prize-winning
Alexievich,
yes, Svetlana. And I'm wondering, have you met her? Has she influenced your work at all?
Means connection. Let's collect the questions. Please, sir, you had a question. Did you? No? No? Okay.
I think we have a question.
Huh?
Instead.
Okay, yes, please, sir. Let's go this way.
Okay. Ioulia, I want to ask you as a sociologist. So I have been watching Ukrainian TV. I have not been to Maidan since its beginning, but I watched TV since few months prior to Maidan over the last 3 years. So, and TV is a powerful tool to shape this generation mentality and future behavior. So, and I want to share with you my 2 reflection from watching Ukrainian TV. I'm not challenging what your findings. I just in addition to what you found. And I sense 2 things which convey to the public. First is its heroization of violence. I mean, I remember 1 year after Maidan, it was a documentary culminated with the pictures of flames on Maidan and Molotov cocktail. And the second, probably exaggerated, but it's my reflection, it's hatred. It's really when you see as if all hate all, you see rather how political parties fight in Rada, you see how ordinary people increasingly dislike, distrust, even despise their government. And of course, culmination is it's Russia. It was a Putin first evil, now it's the whole country, and we talk about Ukraine, which has 20 million people living in the east and south with actual Russian cultural linguistic roots. Thank you. So your opinion, would you disagree? And if agree, how would it shape the society?
Thank you so much. I think the questions that both Ioulia's book and Anna's commentary raise are really important about the role of subjectivity of the researcher and genres of academic writing and the place of emotion and the place of storytelling and how we tell stories in academia. I think that's something that that we struggle with a lot. I actually didn't want my book to be boring, but I wanted to get tenure. So how do you do that? But I think also as a teacher, whenever I teach the Russian Revolution, I never assign Lenin's speeches, I always assign stories. And so I wonder if there's a future for this as well in the classroom and teaching about Maidan and sort of the role of storytelling as a way of conveying experience in a very powerful fashion. And I just wanted to know, when was the exact moment when you knew you needed to write a book?
And last question, Danielle, please. Thanks very much for the book. Sure if this is working. Oh, okay. And I hope that you will write follow-up articles or another book on the volunteers in the hospitals, the military hospitals as well. And that's actually the source of my question. I'm wondering if you witnessed or are witnessing any kind of vicarious trauma or secondary traumatization among these volunteers who are seeing kind of, whether it's PTSD or physical wounds. And if so, what sort of approaches are emerging to deal with that, whether it's self-care mechanisms, some form of institutional support for this kind of vicarious traumatization, or social networks that are providing that support, and just if you'd seen anything and had any commentary on that issue.
Mm-hmm. One sentence per answer.
Yeah, I will be brief. No, it's okay. If I don't provide you the answer, just come to see me during the lunch. Svetlana Alexievich, of course, I know her. I've met her on several occasions without being very close, or I think I was not thinking about the way she has written her books, but I see, yeah, of course, we may see some similarities. She's not a researcher, and she's trying to produce, yeah, different product. Even if I pretend going beyond academic frames, I'm still in academia, so I'm struggling against myself. Yeah, about heroization of violence. I don't watch Ukrainian TV actually, so it will be difficult for me to answer you. What I will turn it on the other way. I have, of course, violent sequences in this book, but what I was interested in, they're not heroes, my characters. Even if I have a personal kind of personal engagement with them, of course, we may disagree, and we often disagree over different issues. I would not have acted in the same way as they have acted, but my idea was to understand them actually, what is behind, and how we become acting like they have acted actually, and that's why I explain this. I show how the distance to the violence may reduce in a critical situation actually, and if you are not a violent person, but you come to use violence also. So I hope I have provided through those stories more complexity in this question of why and how we use violence. Teaching. I use my writing, my academic writing for teaching also, but I agree with you. When teaching history, for example, and I have also to teach history of the Soviet Union, I use also stories because it's the best way. It's like my idea of touch a general public, provoke this edification process. I think we're doing the same actually through those stories in history, and we're here as professors also to contextualize, to maybe provide a counter argument, and etc. So correcting, this kind of influence this process. Misunderstanding, you're right, actually. I decided to write a book because of misunderstanding. I was coming back to Paris and I was asked questions I was not interested in. I have the sequences. I was on Maïdan, it was 21st of February, so after February 20, I received a call from a French newspaper, and the questions they asked me, who have won, Russia or European Union? I was like, guys. So this kind of sequences, I have experienced them less maybe violent way when you come to Paris, and they ask you also to think about geopolitics and produce such kind of knowledge on Maïdan, and you are just no, it's difficult to fit in it. And I think it's by end of April or May, I decided to go back. And to see once again some of, for the first time after Maïdan, some of my characters, and I continued then this kind of returning actually and discussing with them. As for volunteers, I'm about working. I'm working actually on this. One of the women from this volunteer group, she was providing equipment for military and going very often on the front lines, and she's experienced a severe trauma, and she's actually alone. All the other girls are with her, but they do not have the necessary training to provide her and to help her. So they also kind of engage in a bricolage, trying to find kind of solutions, but still, so that's it helps me also to. I mean, the returning is important from this point of view, also to follow in the process. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Unfortunately, we have to stop here. Thank you, Ioulia.